This is screencast 5.6, and this is going to be about pest control methods in agriculture. Of course, everybody wants the best pesticide that leaves the ladybugs and butterflies alive and only kills ugly bugs. But that's assuming that the ugly bugs are the ones that we want to kill. Just because they're ugly doesn't mean that they're bad for agriculture. If you look at the amount of pesticide that's used per area, obviously in China, you can see that there's a pretty high pesticide use. But in the US, we actually use a third of the world's pesticides. If you look in terms of watersheds, right, because that's what we're worried about, pesticides running off into streams and waterways. There's a pretty high amount of pesticide use in the Mississippi River watershed. And then in smaller sheds on the East Coast, you can see in the Carolinas and also in Georgia. So we're going to look at types of different pesticides. So there's broad-scale pesticides, herbicides that kill competing plants against the crops. Fungicides, which kill fungi, right? Rodenticides, which kill rodent, and then other types of insecticides. So the drawbacks, of course, for pesticides is that they're likely to kill non-target species. And the ones we're mostly worried about, of course, are beneficial predators, pollinators, any sort of nitrogen fixers, anything that supports ecosystem services, anything that helps support nutrient cycling. It's hard for there not to be collateral damage if you're killing non-target species. Another drawback is bioaccumulation, and we're going to talk about this more when we get to pollution. But the two different things are bioaccumulation and biomagnification. Bioaccumulation is where the same fish grow and grow, and over their lifespan they accumulate contaminants in their cells. Biomagnification is where it works its way up the food chain, where some small shrimp that have contaminants are eaten by larger fish, which are eaten by seals, which are eaten by polar bears, and because the polar bears have to consume so much food, they get a lot of the contamination. A classic example of this was DDT, where bald eagles were consuming animals that had DDT in them, and the DDT was causing the eggshells of the bald eagles to be too thin, leading to higher mortality of baby bald eagles. Another issue with pesticides, of course, is developed resistance. So if you have some bugs that have a gene that resists the pesticide, it'll kill all the non-resistant bugs, and then the ones that are resistant will survive and reproduce, and eventually most of the bugs will be resistant and the pesticide loses its effectiveness. Another drawback is groundwater pollution. So if you apply the pesticide to the fields and then it rains, the water will percolate through, it'll pick up the pesticides, percolate through to the groundwater, and then over time the groundwater will flow to drinking water wells. How long it takes to do that depends on what part of the aquifer the contamination gets to. So you could have groundwater contamination that takes up to 50 years or longer for it to work itself out. One problem with pesticides getting into water is what we call pesticide drift. And this is how pesticides, even though they're applied in one place, end up farther from their intended location, either because of wind, right? If you apply a pesticide in air, it gets blown away, because of precipitation, where it's run off into drainage, or to actual water flow, like you apply too much pesticide and it gets carried away through the intended water flow mechanisms. Finally, of course, there's toxicity to humans, right? We're applying these pesticides to our crops, but that means that if they're still on the crops when we eat them, then we could be affected by them. So there's all kinds of health effects. It just depends on um, what it is we're being exposed to and how much of it we're being exposed to. Now, one issue that's tied to pesticides actually is genetically modified organisms. So we're going to do a quick detour into that and then come back to pesticides. So genetically modified foods, of course, are um, plants or crops that have been modified by humans. So the top 10 you can see here. Of course, corn and soy are at the top, but then other ones, potatoes, tomatoes, dairy products, right, have been all genetically modified. GMOs are distinguished from, crossbreeding because you consider GMOs to be manipulation of organisms' DNA in a laboratory environment rather than a, outdoor agricultural environment. And so this DNA is added to the organisms that you wouldn't be able to produce through artificial selection or breeding. So there's a lot of stuff that goes into this, but of course, a lot of GMOs are already out there, and in the US, they're not really labeled. So, like I said, artificial selection has produced certain breeds of crops for a very long time. Right? If you consider corn, the way corn works is through artificial selection, how we've grown the types of corn that we have. Same thing for cauliflower, same thing for broccoli. We've turned plants into all of these things through artificial selection. The modern techniques are to isolate specific genes from one organism and transfer it to another. In this way, it's not possible to do it through artificial selection because we may be talking about different species. Of course, there are lots of benefits to GMOs. You can increase the quality or quantity of crops, right? You can make them more productive. You decrease your costs as well by doing this. One way is to produce resistance to pests, right? If your corn has some organism that preys on it, you can make it resistant to that organism. You can make it so the crops need less water, right? So they're resistant to drought. Another benefit, you could add essential nutrients. There's a type of rice called golden rice, which has had vitamin A added. This is kind of the same thing for certain types of potatoes, right? Certain sweet potatoes have more vitamins and nutrients. And so places in the world where they eat lots of potatoes try to help address issues of poverty and malnutrition by adding nutrients to the potatoes, the types of potatoes that people are growing. It's even possible to use plants to create pharmaceutical compounds by growing them, by modifying the genetics of the plants so that they grow the compounds that we need for the pharmaceuticals. This is commonly, or has been used to create insulin. And like we said, you modify these organisms, it reduces your expenses, which increases your profits and ultimately should lower food prices. It's even possible to use GMOs to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, basically by making the crops more efficient. Like the more efficient the crops are, like the fewer crops you need to grow, like the less fertilizer you need, which means that those emissions aren't being created. So what are the problems with GMOs? They are, may or may not be safe for human consumption. Not every GMO has been thoroughly tested in all the possible, all the possible situations. Another issue is whether we're reducing biodiversity or what the effects on biodiversity are. If an animal or a plant has been genetically modified and somehow breeds with a wild animal of the same breed, then what happens? Do we end up with all of one type of, let's say, salmon, for example? And so generally we need to try to keep the genetically modified organisms away from the wild ones. Another drawback is the issue of patenting, and this isn't necessarily an ecological drawback, more like an economic or a social drawback. So companies that create GMOs have been allowed to patent the DNA sequences. And so this becomes a problem because companies will enter into contracts with farmers to grow their crops, but the farmers can't keep the seeds and they can't reuse leftover seeds. They have to return it to the company. And so farmers get in trouble where they used to hang on to seed and now they can't anymore. They'll get sued, and basically the corporations are large enough that they'll generally win these lawsuits. Um, this is an example of one, Bowman versus Monsanto, um, where the Supreme Court unanimously ruled in favor of Monsanto's patents. Of the type of seeds or the types of seeds that are out there, the 10 biggest companies control almost 75% of the seeds that are available. You might want, if you are a farmer, to just not use those seeds from the big companies, but you don't really have a lot of options. And this is how we intersect back with the pesticides. The issue is companies like Monsanto make genetically modified seeds that are resistant to pesticides that Monsanto also sells. So if you're a farmer and you don't buy Monsanto seeds, then you're going to have trouble using the pesticides or the herbicides because they're more likely to kill your crops. So farmers get locked in. They buy the seeds from Monsanto, they buy the pesticide, the herbicide from Monsanto, and they don't really have any options. This is pretty big business. You can see that companies like Bayer and Monsanto, Dow and DuPont, we're talking about tens, hundreds of billions of dollars that they make every year from seed sales and from pesticide sales. So I said there was no labeling in the US. The regulations on GMOs mainly are in Europe. So in the US, there's no mandated labeling. The EU actually bans many genetically modified organisms. Organic food, right? Organic is a label. It's not just a name, but companies that put the organic label on their food has to meet certain standards. And so the labeling is important because if there's not uniform labeling, people who are not informed don't know what's going on. So there's really no way to tell from the labeling whether GMOs are safe. And so some people think if it's labeled, it must be unsafe, which is not necessarily true. Right, well, that is Screencast 5.6. Let me know if you have any questions.